Next up, we have Dennis Porter. Dennis is the co-founder and CEO, of Satoshi Action Fund. He has been pretty instrumental in some shifting regulatory front in the US, including helping support the right to mine legislation. Just like, the right to bear arms, the US now has a right to mine in 2 different states. Dennis is going to be giving a talk that dives into Bitcoin mining and how it can lower methane, how it can provide energy stability, and sorry guys, I'm a little tired. And also I lost Dennis. But he's going to walk us through sort of basically the environmental benefits of Bitcoin mining, which I hope will also answer some further questions, and also the benefits. And Dennis has engaged in a number of peer-reviewed papers, and he's sort of been on the forefront of helping shift hearts and minds on why Bitcoin mining is important from an energy security perspective in the US. Okay, come on up, sir.
Thank you. Oh, very happy to be here. This is my first time in Frankfurt, first time in Germany. Big round of applause for Mags, by the way. She's doing an incredible job hosting today. My name is Dennis Porter. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Satoshi Action Fund, and I'm also the founder and president of Satoshi Action Education. That's a pair of nonprofits. Ultimately, what we do as an organization is we advocate for Bitcoin, particularly Bitcoin mining. What we want to do is we want to educate lawmakers and regulators on the benefits of this technology, and we also want to help craft model policy as well as research around this topic so that lawmakers really understand the value of what Bitcoin mining can bring to their jurisdictions. I think oftentimes we hear a lot of 30,000-foot view conversations about what Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining can do. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get into the specifics of some of the things that Daniel talked about and some of the things that Harold talked about with regards to why investors would be interested in Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. So there's a lot of benefits that you could talk about with Bitcoin, so many different benefits. But I really want to focus today on these 3 key benefits of Bitcoin mining. And those 3 key benefits are how Bitcoin mining can enhance green energy, how Bitcoin mining can balance the grid, and that third one, how Bitcoin mining can mitigate methane emissions. Although I may move quickly through that third one because you got a pretty good round conversation from Batten on that specific topic. So let's start with enhancing green energy. We even had some really great questions earlier. How exactly can Bitcoin mining play a role in enhancing green energy technologies? Specifically, I'm going to focus here in this conversation on wind and solar. One of the things that I personally love about Bitcoin mining is that it is a piece of energy infrastructure. It is a tool that can help you achieve your energy goals. Whatever those energy goals are, it can help you overcome obstacles. It can help you solve problems in an energy system. And so I really like to focus my conversations and my conversations with investors, my conversations with those that are advocates in this space on specific problems that Bitcoin mining can solve in an energy system. So what is the major problem that Bitcoin mining can solve for wind and solar? That problem is curtailment. If you're wondering what curtailment is, real quickly, curtailment is the reduction of output of an energy resource below what it could otherwise have produced. So wind and solar. Wind and solar are geographically dependent, highly geographically dependent. As Daniel mentioned earlier, West Texas is where the wind and the sun is. That's where they're building the clean energy. But they have to transport that energy back to the other side of the state where the demand is at. And oftentimes there can be imbalances. And ultimately, if you have, let's say, let's do round numbers, 100 megawatt wind farm in West Texas, and it's only able to get, let's say, 70% of its energy to market, that 30% that it wasn't able to get to market, that 30 megawatts, is considered curtailed energy. I also like to call it wasted energy. Some other terms that are used are stranded energy. So how much curtailment is taking place, though, right? How big is this problem? Is it a small problem? Is it a medium-sized problem? Is it a large problem? Well, let's put it in direct context so that you can really truly understand how much curtailed energy that we are dealing with across the world. Let's take, for example, CAISO. That is California's ISO. They manage the entire state's grid, and they also measure all of the curtailment that is taking place on that grid. They're one of the best at measuring the curtailments that are taking place on their energy system. This chart is from 2022. Of course, it starts further back in 2015. But as you can see, there's a dramatic explosion in the amount of curtailment that is taking place in the CAISO energy grid. In fact, it's such a big problem that they are actually currently curtailing roughly 2.5 million megawatt hours of energy in 2022 alone. But the goal in California is to double. They want to double the amount of wind and solar that they have on their energy system there. And so let's take an assumption. Let's assume that if you double deployments, you'll double curtailments. Now, you may be off one way to the side or to the other, but let's just take that assumption. If you double your curtailments, by 2030, the state of California will curtail roughly 5 million megawatts of energy. And to put that energy number in context, that is more energy than the bottom 36 nations used combined. It's an incredible amount of power, and it's only happening in just this one state, albeit it's a very large economic hub with a lot of wind and solar. That is just one place in the world where we see this type of curtailment taking place, and it's happening all across the world. Anywhere you're building large amounts of wind and solar, you're seeing large amounts of curtailment. But to put it, so I said, let's assume that we're going to double curtailments. It's not really much of an assumption because I started tracking this number in 2022, and as you can see going into 2024, the number continues to grow up and to the right. But why does curtailment take place? There are really two main reasons. It's a time problem and it's a location problem. You have energy being created at a time when no one needs it, and you have energy being generated in locations where no one is there to buy it. So let's take that first problem. Why is there too much power when no one needs it? Why does this take place? Well, wind and solar are intermittent energy assets that depend on the weather or the sun being in the sky in order for them to generate energy. Let's take this graph really quickly. I use ChatGPT to design it, so it's not a real graph from a real energy system. But you can find graphs that are very similar to this all across the web. Take a moment, Google it, you'll see it very quickly, and I'll show you some more of them in a moment. But I wanted to design it this way to just really simply explain why we're seeing a significant amount of curtailment, particularly around solar. So this is a solar graph. You see, of course, the big arc is when solar generation is taking place, when the sun is in the sky. You see the dotted line, the dashed line across is demand. The reason why it dips in the middle of the day is because many of us go to work. We leave our homes, which actually is most of where energy demand takes place. You know, when we're leaving our home, we're not using our heating, we're not using our cooling, we're not using our microwaves. And so you see demand dip. And that's the exact moment, in fact, when solar generation is at its peak. And so that's why you see these very large spreads where there's so much curtailment taking place. And there's another chart that we like to use to measure this. It's called the duck curve. How many of you have seen this chart, the duck curve chart? So basic explanation, since many of you in the room haven't seen this chart, is that this is a demand chart minus the amount of solar generation that's taking place. And so you can see every single year, the more solar generation that we build, the more net demand drops, which ultimately results in more and more and more curtailment. And just for the sake of Germany, I'm just wanting to highlight that, of course, this is a global problem. That chart was from California. This one is here on the German grid, and you see the exact type of load pattern being created. And of course, the reason why they call it the duck curve is because it looks a little bit like a duck, I guess. So how does Bitcoin mining help solve this excess generation problem? Well, Bitcoin mining is an extremely flexible load, and it can perfectly match the generation patterns of wind or solar. And this is an ability that is very limited. There's very few industries, if maybe none, some would say, that can perfectly match a generation pattern, but Bitcoin mining can. Now, on that second problem, Why is there generation being created that can't get to market? It's a location problem. Well, you have wind and solar, often built in remote rural areas because it needs to be where the wind and the sun are bright and where the wind is strong. And then you often have transmission lines, which are built after the fact. They build the wind and solar, and they wait for the transmission lines to be built. Very common practice in the wind and energy sectors. And those two things combined, of course, create bottlenecks, or the lack of ability to get generation to market. So how does Bitcoin mining help solve this lack of transmission problem? Well, it's pretty obvious. Bitcoin mining can be placed anywhere in the world. It's location agnostic, almost the polar opposite of wind and solar. Wind and solar are highly geographically dependent. Bitcoin mining has no restrictions on where it can be placed, especially with the advent of things like Starlink. So whenever energy is being rejected because it can't get to the market, the Bitcoin miner is buying it. And of course, as was highlighted before, this is backed up by research. In fact, Brad Jones, the former ERCOT CEO, and also the former New York ISO CEO, co-authored a paper alongside us, which endorsed this idea that Bitcoin mining is a powerful energy tool that can help to enhance green energy. Okay, let's go to the next one. Although, I'm a little thirsty and I didn't get my water ready first. Okay, number 2, balancing the grid. You hear this a lot. Bitcoin mining balances the grid. But we don't really often hear exactly how this works. Well, there are 2 main ways that Bitcoin mining can balance the grid. There are others, which I won't get into. Gets a little technical, but let's focus on these main 2. Demand response. How many people have heard that term now? Demand response. Okay, good. So a lot of us are starting to hear that terminology. What about frequency response? Okay, half as many hands, maybe quarter as many hands. Let's jump into what demand response is and how Bitcoin mining is a great demand response resource. And then I'll quickly finish up with, of course, frequency response as well. So this is a quick chart helping to highlight what demand response is. And of course, anybody can participate in these types of programs. I think that's a really important part to mention here. Any load can be a demand response resource if they want it to be. Not all can, because for economic reasons, and not all can for technical reasons or logistical reasons. But theoretically, any load could participate this way. And what you see is you have on the blue line the forecasted demand, and then you have the red line where right when it reaches peak capacity, the response from a load is they shut off, preventing demand from outstripping supply. I wanted to highlight also, this is a technology, this is a type of load resource which is dramatically growing in its importance as wind and solar and other types of intermittent energy assets come onto our grid. And I was able to have a great conversation with the former FERC senior economist, David Cathan, when he retired from FERC. His literal signature is on many of the orders from FERC, which is our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the United States. He's signing the documents on these types of programs as they come into effect. And when I talked to him, I said, I explained to him a little bit about Bitcoin mining and the power of Bitcoin mining. And he asked me a question. He said, is Bitcoin mining a large user of energy? And I said, yes, of course. It's well known. It's a very large user of energy. And then he said, does it want to be on all the time if given the chance? Yes, of course. You hear a lot of these Bitcoin miners talking about uptime. They want to be up as long as possible. When they're up, they're mining, they're making money. But then the third one, and the most important, can it turn down for any length of time, at any amount of time, at any time of the day, if requested to do so by the grid? Yes, of course. Bitcoin mining is one of the most flexible loads on the planet. It can shut off at any time and for any length of time. And he said to me, if those 3 things are true, and this is coming from one of the top people in one of the most important regulatory commissions in the world, of course he retired, he said if those 3 things are true, then Bitcoin mining is the best demand response resource on the planet. Powerful statement from one of the most important people in the energy sector. So, how do Bitcoin mining data centers perform as demand response resources as compared to other types of assets. Let's take a quick look. I talked a little bit about this on the panel yesterday. China bans Bitcoin mining, a really important event in 2021. Where do the miners go? They go to Texas. A large portion of them go to Texas. And when they plug in, they start signing up for grid balancing programs. They created a new category for them called large flexible load. And that's what you see here in the yellow, the large flexible load category. It's all Bitcoin mining. Now, some other large flexible loads have come in since this time, but at this moment, they created the category and they helped to categorize Bitcoin mining as large flexible load. ERCOT put out a report. It's called a Winter Resource Report. They want to see and calculate what are all the types of resources across the grid, batteries, generation, flexible load, so they can have an understanding of what's in their toolbox when various types of winter emergencies could take place. And they put that Bitcoin mining has 1,700 megawatts, or 1.7 gigawatts of resource capacity on the grid there in ERCOT. Well, lo and behold, 2 months later, a massive winter storm comes through, smashes into the Texas grid, brings the Texas grid to its knees. But at this time, Texas had a new tool in its toolbox, and that's Bitcoin mining. The Bitcoin miners were there. They were the front line of defense. They wound down, delivered all of their power back to the energy system for ratepayers, hospitals, police officers, firehouses to use in that time of emergency. And to put it in context, 1,700 megawatts of power is enough energy for 1.7 million small homes to heat their homes, all during the middle of an emergency. When everyone else is raising their power consumption, the miners are willing to shut off. Of course, there are incentive programs to encourage this type of behavior. One of the most important parts of this, I think that's important to understand is, I said it earlier, anybody could participate this way. Anybody could theoretically wind down. What are the impacts of winding down? Well, if you were to shut down what was 30% of the network at the time, you can see the hash rate dipping here. That's the period when the winter response was happening between the two blue lines. 30% of the network came offline during that period. Not just in Texas, of course. There were states nearby as well. And the Bitcoin network, what did it do? It kept printing block after block. Of course, block times may be a little slower, but the network kept on moving forward. Now imagine for a second, if you shut down 30% of Amazon's data centers, what impact that would have on the internet. You would see network outages all across the world, but not with Bitcoin. That's really important to keep in mind here, is when Bitcoin responds, then Bitcoin is still working. If an Amazon data center were to respond, the web would, AWS, all these things that support our ability to call our friends, to have Zoom calls, to order an Uber, would experience significant outages. Also important to highlight, this is not only happening during winter emergencies, it's also happening during heat waves as well. And of course, there was a similar response just that summer, later in 2022, 2023, where 1,000 megawatts turned down so that Texans could keep their homes cool. Now let's take a look at what happens when you have a grid without flexible load and what type of responses are in your toolbox and what happens when you add flexible load, just to help give you a visualization. So this is an energy system before flexible load. You have your local power consumption, you have your capacity, spare capacity, and then you have, of course, the flat line, which is your total capacity on that local grid. Now, of course, these are a little bit wavy and changing in real time, but this is a very simplified version of what it would look like. So what happens when you go over your electrical capacity? If you don't respond, if you don't find a way to add more power to the grid, your grid will potentially collapse. You'll get rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts, which can lead to system-wide outages. So before flexible load, the way you could respond, the way you could prevent your grid from collapsing was you would have, look on the right, gas peaker plants, batteries, flywheels, pumped hydro, gravitational, and thermal energy. Now these are all great, various types of technologies, but they're all have varying downsides. Some are very expensive, and in the case of gas peaker plants, which is actually the most common form of grid balancing technologies used today, very expensive, very carbon intensive, if not the most carbon intensive, and also they're very inefficient, so they're only turning on every once in a while. So the cost for electricity just goes through the roof. But it's a necessity to make sure that our grids don't collapse. Well, instead of spending money on carbon-intensive and expensive energy sources like peaker plants, you could instead have a consistent, flexible load which is available any time of the day for any length of time to be able to respond and prevent those types of outages from occurring, ultimately doing two important things: reducing the cost of balancing the grid and reducing the amount of emissions that it takes to balance the grid. I added this one last night. I thought it was really important to help highlight just the power of how Bitcoin mining can help to stabilize the grid and also reduce the cost of power. Anybody notice this photo on the left? It's like a shopping mall. You know, in the US, I think Sears is out of business now, but let's say Dillard's, or we've got JCPenney. These are companies that are still in business. What's the big one here in Germany? What's your big department store? Nobody? Okay. So let's say someone comes along and says, well, I think JCPenney is using too much space. Let's get rid of them. Too much space. We need extra space in case someone else wants to come in and use the shopping mall. Well, right away, the moment that happens, the person who owns that shopping mall, they own that system, they would see a reduction in their revenue. In order to compensate for that reduction in revenue, they'd have to raise the rents of everybody else that's still within that shopping mall. So I think that we can all agree this is a bad idea for the shopping mall. He wants to keep as many people as the utilization of that shopping mall as high as possible, so he can maximize his rents while also distributing the cost. Because either way, he's going to experience the same monthly, yearly costs of keeping that shopping mall open, regardless of how many tenants that they have. So the energy systems are very much the same. What if someone woke up today and said, well, that factory, that Bitcoin mine, that's using too much power. We should get rid of them. Well, that, of course, would be a terrible mistake. Because the moment you get rid of your large user of power, your tenant customer of energy, you're dropping the amount of revenue that's generated by that energy system, and you're forced to then distribute those costs which are not being absorbed by the Bitcoin miner to the rest of the grid, raising rates for everyone else. And so full utilization of a shopping mall and full utilization of an energy system is important, something which was more difficult to achieve previously until Bitcoin mining came along. And of course, you can essentially go to 100%. They used to say you can't have full utilization of an energy system because you need a little extra in case there's a peak demand moment, in case there's a winter storm. Well, now you have the Bitcoin miner ready, willing, and able to maintain yourself at 100%, but also wind down as much as needed to keep the grid balanced. Last one here, and I'll move through this one very quickly, just for the sake of time. Demand response, we all understand that pretty well now. Frequency response is like the little brother. It's important to understand quickly what frequency is. Frequency is the heartbeat of the grid. Here in Europe, it's 50 hertz, must be maintained all the time. Slight deviations are okay, very slight deviations are okay. If you go too low, if you go too high, you will experience rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts pretty quickly. If you wait too long to respond, you'll get a system-wide outage, which is a black start, total collapse. It can take weeks or months to recover from this. So ultimately, the problem is that as we moved away from thermal energy generation, which is a rotating mass which creates inertia on the grid, towards renewable energy, we're required to have quicker and quicker responses to these deviations in energy generation on the grid. So how do we make sure that we can use Bitcoin mining as a frequency response resource? And how does it compare? So these are the various types of responses. You can see very quickly you've got all different types. You've got generation, you've got batteries on here, and there are varying types of responses. But if you look at that bottom right-hand corner, you can see the first line is when the energy shifts, and the second line is when it needs to respond by in order for it to be actually considered a valuable frequency response resource. And as you can tell, bottom right-hand corner, just like that. You're right where you need to be programmatically if you have a load resource that can respond. Most loads, unfortunately, cannot respond this quickly. But as we've highlighted here, as others have highlighted, Bitcoin mining is one of the most flexible, rapid, and programmatic loads on the planet, and it is always ready and willing to respond in times of need. This is just a quick graph to put it in context for what you can see, a visualization. That blue line is frequency. As it deviates downwards, you see an automatic response from the Bitcoin miners, helping to supplant the frequency and maintain that heartbeat on the grid. And again, the same paper that was written earlier talking about how Bitcoin mining is a powerful tool, a powerful energy tool, co-authored by former New York ISO CEO, former ERCOT CEO, also backing up these claims. All right, last section here. Mitigating methane. What is methane? Why is it a problem? Well, methane is a very powerful, potent greenhouse gas that is up to 2,500% worse, or 28 times worse, 25 times worse. I like the bigger numbers, 2,500% worse than CO2 for warming. It's exploded in the atmosphere. There are agencies across the world that are realizing that they need to tackle this problem. 150 plus nations have pledged to reduce their methane emissions. But beyond just methane being a potent greenhouse gas, it is also a toxic gas, and it can cause ground level ozone, which is not only bad to breathe, but it can seep into the water as well and cause major toxic poisons. So how does Bitcoin mining solve this problem? It is very, very simple. Methane as a source comes from a landfill. It can come from oil and gas. It can come from dairy farms. You take the methane. It is a combustible gas. It burns. You can put it into a generator or a turbine, generating electricity, and you can use that electricity to mine Bitcoin. Very simple. So can mining with Bitcoin off methane emissions reduce the emissions profile of Bitcoin? I think Daniel did an incredible job of talking about this earlier, but I think the one chart of his that I like the most, which I use here, is just how carbon negative, or CO2e equivalent, it is to mine with methane. And as you can see, flared methane mitigation produces 1,006 CO2e equivalent of carbon, and then we're talking about grams here. And then if you do it with vented, which of course flared is something that's being burnt currently, as you take that flare down, you're becoming more efficient. With vented, it's methane that's going vented into the atmosphere with no mitigation whatsoever. And of course, that's going to be extremely CO2e negative. Now, this is the most interesting paper that we produced recently, because we were able to get these claims backed up in a top 2% journal, in a peer-reviewed journal, which was a huge accomplishment for us as an organization. We, of course, had produced other peer-reviewed articles before, other research articles before, but this is our first time getting into a top 2% journal, and we were very excited to be able to back up the claims that we were making about this technology. So, last point here is, though, it's just not us, it's not just the industry, it's not just the science. You actually have the White House itself backing up the claims that Bitcoin mining can be a powerful tool that can yield positive results for the climate. So in conclusion, let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin mining and how it compares. I talked about this a little bit earlier. I think it's important. This is the current administration. Yes. They put out a climate report. It was one of the only positive things they said, so there was a lot of negative things in there for sure. In conclusion, let's do a little comparison. I talked about this earlier, but how does Bitcoin compare to CoreWeave, AI data centers, to Amazon and Google? Only Bitcoin mining can run completely off of variable energy alone, variable renewable energy alone. Only Bitcoin mining can shut off at any time of the day for any length of time without experiencing any major economic downturns or supply chain issues. And only Bitcoin mining can scale to any size constraints, which is important because you have such varying constraints of generation availability with wind and solar and with methane. So, in conclusion, Bitcoin mining and proof of work mining are enhancing our green energy, stabilizing our grid, and mitigating methane emissions. And I think it's important that we all understand the power of this technology and a little bit of the detail that goes behind it so that we can truly share the benefits with our regulators, our decision makers, and our lawmakers so that we as a country and as a world can start to move forward with Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. Thank you.
Oh. Any questions for Dennis? Sir, in the back.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a conversion rate for hydrogen. I don't remember
Can you repeat the question?
I think he was asking that how do you compare Bitcoin mining using the methane as an energy source versus converting it to green hydrogen? Was that the question? I'm not a green hydrogen expert, but my understanding is that green hydrogen is the conversion, sort of like the energy output you get, because the conversion you get, there's a loss of energy during that conversion. So the potential to use it for Bitcoin mining, you're going to have a higher energy utilization rate versus converting it to hydrogen. I'm not opposed to green hydrogen, but I'm also not an expert on that specific area. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, you can transport it. You can move it around. But one thing I think is important to highlight is also that a lot of landfills across the world are too small for it to make any economic sense to do anything other than Bitcoin mining. Because the development of the green hydrogen and the transportation of that green hydrogen, it all costs money. Yeah. Whereas the Bitcoin mine is making money immediately on the site, and the cost of building and the size constraints are better.
Wait.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah. Baden will be the expert on this one.
We actually looked at it for landfills as one possibility. We talked to a guy who'd done 20 years worth of methane mitigation on landfills. Generally speaking, it's the worst thing you can do in terms of economics and in terms of loss of efficiency, hydrogen mining.
Question?
What was the incentive for the miners during the winter and the heat to shut down their operations? Did they get kind of a compensation, and how sustainable is this motivation for the future?
Yeah, so anytime you're going to see, so there's really two ways or two reasons why a Bitcoin miner would respond to any sort of deviation in energy generation. One is because of the cost of energy goes up, and so miners are very price sensitive. Most of them have a specific break-even price, which is relatively low. And so if the price of energy spikes, they're going to shut off just for cost avoidance. So no matter what, we do nothing, we don't need to have a policy, we don't need to have an incentive. If we do nothing but create price signals, miners can just respond to the price signal. Now, additionally, there are programs where you have demand response programs. You have another program called for coincident peaks, which is a transmission program to avoid too much demand on an energy system during those peak demand moments. And those programs are created where they say, okay, anybody out there can sign up and say, okay, I'll be willing to respond. You do usually get a little bit of compensation for signing up. You say, I'll be available, and you get a small amount of compensation. And those compensations can be, it depends on the energy system. They're different everywhere you go in the world. Some are direct payments. Some are credits towards future energy bills. And once they respond, of course, then they can be paid an additional credit or compensation immediately as well. So there's really two ways. One is there's a program. These are programs that are being created and designed, predating Bitcoin mining. One last thing I think also there as well is Bitcoin miners are so good at doing this, they're actually driving down the cost of delivering these services to the grid. So in Texas, in fact, there's actually a political effort underway to keep Bitcoin miners out of these programs because they're so good at doing it, they're pushing other players out of the marketplace. So they're actually driving down the cost of delivering grid balancing services and ultimately driving down the cost of delivering power.